The Tormented by James McKimmey. A chilling evening wind blew across the small crossroads town on the spine of the Coast Range Mountains. Inside the Copper Lantern Bar and restaurant, the air was fragrant and warm from logs blazing in the huge stone fireplace. The aroma of charcoal-broiled steaks and garlic bread came from the restaurant section, whose broad windows overlooked the vast spread of the San Francisco Peninsula below. David Farrell sat at the L-shaped bar and ordered another beer. It was a Thursday and customers were sparse. Only 2 parties were dining. Farrell and 3 other locals sat at the bar. One was Vince Ecker, a regular. "Egg skull," Ecker boomed to Farrell from down the bar. Loudly, Farrell thought, always loudly. He turned his head to look at the large, sinewy man whose eyes were the color of gunmetal, which was appropriate, Farrell thought. "I'm thinking Ecker." Ecker wheezed, and there was no other description for his laughter. "That's what you do, all right, Egg Skull. Think. But it don't make you any money." The man wore a black nylon jacket, tan Levi's, and hunting boots. A white Stetson was pushed back from his pulpy, cruel face. His ski-styled sunglasses rested on the dark wood beside his beer bottle. He grasped the bottle with a broad, stub-fingered hand and drank. He was a primitive, Farrell thought bitterly, born into an advanced civilization that had done little to bring him up beyond his animal status. He had been able to secure himself a good living as a construction foreman. He also owned a shrewd, childlike ability to make the savage cut, as he had just done again. He knew that Farrell had received a lengthy college education, but Ecker also knew that Farrell was presently living near pauperhood, trying to support a wife and child on the meager pay he received as a book clerk in Palo Alto, 10 miles below. But that particular situation was going to be corrected, Farrell thought. "Is that the extent of your contribution?" he asked acidly. He was as large as Ecker, but there was a difference in their physiques. Beneath Farrell's bulk was fat, not muscle. His face was pale against the weathered brownness of Ecker's. He would have liked to have suddenly transformed into a tough and muscular specimen in order to take care of Ecker physically, but there were more realistic ways. "I was wondering if you want to go night cooning again," Ecker said. Farrell turned away as Ecker began wheezing again. He remembered vividly that night 2 weeks ago when he'd gone hunting with Ecker. Out of some foolish belief that he should test his courage in Ecker's presence, he'd agreed to it despite the fact that, unlike Ecker, he had never wanted to see any animal killed. He got into the man's pickup truck with 4 lean hounds inside the special compartment built on the flatbed behind. They'd drive onto a narrow road at the rear of the large rental ranch owned by Martin Brynmart, a retired investor who lived in seclusion in a sizable house built on that land. He got out of the cab as the carbine carrying Ecker had walked behind the truck to open the dog's compartment. The hounds sprang out in smooth, stretching leans and immediately began ranging, noses to the ground and yipping. Ecker switched on his powerful flashlight as the dogs found a scent and gathered to bound into the darkness. Farrell was a lover of nature. He particularly liked animals. He loved to hike through the hills to observe deer grazing on the highest slopes. He liked to see rabbits springing away from his step. He liked cats and dogs, even the hounds owned by Ecker, who had been bred and trained to lead the butcher to his quarry. All animals, he thought, could be categorized into just what they were. The devious breed was human. He cared little for any one of those, including his son Jolly, and certainly his wife Millie, who refused to allow him to own a pet of any kind. Yet here he was, walking across a field with a killer of deer, raccoons, anything on which he could sight his gun. Because he was growing increasingly more nervous, he tried to make conversation. "Doesn't Brynmart mind our being out here at night?" "Minds any time, Egg Skull. To hell with him. I've took more deer meat off this land of his than you can figure. What's he gonna do about it?" "He's peculiar, isn't he?" "Hermit. That's what he is. Even his own foreman don't get beyond his fence. Only me, when I deliver his supplies every Saturday." "How come you, Ecker?" "I trained his dogs. You ever see them?" "I hiked in one day to where Rawls' house is by the gate. I saw them." He pictured those 2 dogs running back and forth behind the steel barbed wire topped fence that Martin Brynmart had ordered built around his house. German shepherds, trained to attack on command. Trained, he now learned, by Vince Ecker. "Them dogs would listen to 2 people only. Brynmart and me. No more, though. They're dead and buried." "What happened?" "Someone threw them a hunk of poisoned meat. Now I gotta train me 2 more for him." Farrell stepped gingerly over the tufted grass. "I hear Brynmart's rich." "Yeah. Ecker said shortly. Why does he hide away like that? Who knows? He's a nut. But Farrell was not so sure about that. Having seen Bryn Mawr's sanctuary, he'd become increasingly envious of the man. Bryn Mawr's life, he decided, was one of perfection. Free of all worries and all responsibilities, he could live exactly as he chose. As Farrell moved apprehensively through the night, with the dogs running ahead of them, he was regretting everything. Because of a small inheritance, he had been able to remain in college for graduate study in English literature. He'd been content there. But then he'd met Millie and made the unfortunate mistake of marrying her on a slightly drunken weekend in Reno. Now they had Jolly, a bit under 2 years old. Farrell, who'd failed at a brief stint of teaching, had been required to become a clerk in a bookstore to support them. He would gladly, he thought, trade places with Martin Bryn Mawr. The sound of the dogs turned into a wild chorus of barks and yelps. Ecker hurried his pace. They got one! Farrell followed him reluctantly over the rise of a hill, then down where the dogs were gathered around the trunk of an oak. Eckert pointed his flashlight upward to find the treed raccoon. The animal's eyes glowed against the light. Ecker handed Farrell the flash. Listening to the bedlam of the dogs, feeling his throat dry, Farrell held the beam on the raccoon as Ecker carefully lifted his carbine. There was the crack of the rifle, and Farrell closed his eyes. As Ecker reclaimed the flashlight, Farrell looked again and saw that the raccoon had dropped to the ground, where it was slashing, biting, and growing viciously as the dogs darted at it. You didn't kill him, he managed. Hell no, Ecker said happily. The dogs do that. I just winged him. Farrell watched in horror as a small hound's belly was slashed by the raccoon's claws. You're letting your own dogs get killed. I get some more, Ecker said in delight. Farrell looked again at the bloody, raging battle. Then he trotted away. He stumbled over another small rise and sat down weakly beside the trunk of a small, wind-warped tree. He thought he would be sick for a time, listening to that wild sound of battle behind him. Then he came to himself. He finally realized that he was sitting in a small cleft of a hill which rose directly above Martin Bryn Mawr's house, no more than 500 yards below. Outside the fencing, there were the lights of the smaller house used by the foreman, Cass Rawl. Then the long run of dark space to the larger house where light shone from a wide window. Farrell used his excellent eyes to see that Bryn Mawr was reading a book in a leather chair beside a desk and a fireplace. He was lean, white-haired, and wore dark-rimmed glasses. He put the book down and walked to a wall. He reached under a corner of the desk, and a panel of the knotty pine wall slid back. He reached inside the recess and drew out what was obviously a packet of currency. He put his hand beneath the corner of the desk again. The panel closed. He placed the packet in a drawer of the desk, then returned to his chair and began reading again. Farrell rubbed his mouth. Finally, he returned to the truck, where he waited in the cab until he was startled to find Ecker's flash suddenly lighting the hood. A ripped carcass of a raccoon was slapped down on the metal. Ecker wheezed with laughter. What's the matter, Egg Skull? You don't like a little fun? Farrell poured beer from his new bottle and listened to Ecker wheezing again. He just don't like that night coon in no way. The bartender diplomatically refused comment. Instead, he said, How's that new Winchester working out, Vince? Best you can buy, Ecker said with enthusiasm. I got that thing zeroed in so I could shoot the eye out of a gnat at 1,000 yards. Farrell sat holding his glass, staring straight ahead, reviewing everything he'd learned since he'd seen Martin Bryn Mawr remove that currency from the recess hidden behind the paneling. By discreet questioning, he'd found out that Bryn Mawr never left the privacy of his fenced acreage. One of the single personal contacts he made was with Cass Rawl, his foreman. Most of that was accomplished by phone. Fees for renting his ranch land were collected in cash by Rawl, who then turned them over to Bryn Mawr. Farrell was reasonably certain that the man used no bank. The only other person who dealt with Bryn Mawr was Ecker, who was paid to bring in Bryn Mawr's supplies every Saturday morning, a habit begun when Bryn Mawr had added the attack dogs to his protection. No one but Ecker could have gone past them. But Bryn Mawr was now temporarily without dogs, and that, Farrell thought, was going to make the difference. Give credit to Ecker for it. Farrell had heard the general community opinion that it had been Ecker himself who'd poisoned the animals. They would have accepted meat from no one but Ecker or Bryn Mawr, in order to sell Bryn Mawr 2 new ones. Ecker was disliked by most everyone who knew him, and that too, Farrell told himself, was going to count. The door opened. The cutting wind blew through the interior. The logs in the great fireplace snapped as blue-yellow flames wavered. Cass Rawls stepped in, wearing a cowhide jacket with butter-colored Sherpa pile, a full black Stetson, overall pants, and worn cowboy boots. He was a thin man in his early 30s, but his face was already deeply lined from exposure to weather. He nodded briefly to Farrell, who had talked to him casually last week when Rawl had stated his dislike for Ecker in his North Texas drawl. A damned sadistic butcher. If Mr. Bryn Mawr hadn't got hooked up with him on account of the dogs, I'd never let him set foot on the ranch. The way it is, he delivers supplies every Saturday, 9 in the morning. I press the switch, open the gate, wave him through. That's all I'll have to do with him. I ever catch him hunting on Mr. Bryn Mawr's property, I'll see he's prosecuted. Rawl walked to Ecker, who smiled and looked at his beer bottle. Rawl handed him a folded sheet of paper. List of stuff he wants Saturday. Okay. Somebody was coon hunting 2 weeks ago. Herded at night. If I catch a man doing that on Mr. Bryn Mawr's property, I go for him personally. You told me that already. You think it was me? I know it was. Maybe it was Farrell over there. Give him the lecture. Somebody's been night hunting deer, too, freezing them with a flashlight and shooting them that way. Next time he does it, he'll get the book thrown at him. Wonder who it was, Ecker said, still smiling. Somebody using a Winchester 70. How do you know? I know the sound. Ecker shrugged. Doubt it, but even if you do, lots of people use a Winchester 70. Deliver the supplies, Ecker, Rawl said tightly. Train the dogs. Otherwise, stay off the land and away from Mr. Bryn Mawr. He wheeled and left. Ecker delivered his laugh and pushed his empty beer bottle away. I gotta get home and feed them dogs. 7 I got now, counting the new shepherds. Farrell tapped the bar and placed the bill on the wood. Buy him a beer. Ecker looked at him in surprise. What's gotten into you? I'm trying to make friends. Complaining? Hell no, he said contemptuously. Let's have the beer. Farrell observed the few cars parked in the near darkness outside. There were no street lamps. The only lightning came from an orange neon sign on top of the building and another in the window of the general store down the street. Ecker's pickup was parked beside Farrell's old Plymouth sedan. He stepped between the two vehicles and looked into the interior of the pickup. The keys were in the ignition. Ecker's Winchester, with its mounted scope, was held by specially installed clamps along the front edge of the seat just above the flooring. The habits of a man, Farrell thought, were in direct ratio to his personality. Ecker was an egotistical bully. He believed that no one would dare take something he owned. As a result, he carelessly left his car in this condition. Looking toward the bar, hoping the extra beer would hold Ecker in there, Farrell opened the left-hand door. He leaned inside and carefully removed the rifle from the clamps. He moved quickly to the rear of his own car, lifted the door of the trunk, and placed Ecker's rifle there. Then he picked up a second rifle, same model with an identical scope, and closed the trunk. He stepped back to the pickup, pushed the second Winchester into the clamps, then softly closed the truck's door. As he got into his Plymouth, he realized that he was breathing quickly. He drove away, regretting only the memory he'd paid for that rifle at a large and busy sporting goods store in San Francisco, where, he was certain, he would never be remembered. It had taken most of what meager savings he'd had in the bank, but it was an investment that would pay returns, if it worked. He stopped his car beside the small cabin he'd rented to house his family, then walked through the wet wind into a steamy kitchen which smelled familiarly of ham and lima beans. Millie looked at him reproachfully. Her hair was in curlers, her permanent due, he thought dismally. The lines of her plump face, she was 15 pounds heavier now than when he'd married her, were set in that vacant expression worn ever since Jolly had been delivered. Her voice came forth in a thin, high whine. I have to hold dinner every night. So you do, he said wearily, and looked into the living room where Jolly was trying to work his portable crib into a wall by yanking back and forth on a top slat. Night after night, Millie shrilled. He walked into the living room and sat down in an ancient easy chair. Jolly saw him and started babbling loudly. Moments later, the crib jarred into one of Farrell's shins. Grunting with pain, he stared back in fury at the wet, wicked smile Jolly was showing him. Vince Ecker's redwood house, its shingles, catching the last light of the following day, was in a secluded hollow at the north edge of the sparsely housed community. Farrell stood in the protection of a thick grove of trees above, watching the man working one of the shepherds in the fenced area of his dog run. He wore the protective gear of an attack dog trainer and held a small leather whip with frayed ends, which he repeatedly snapped into the dog's nose. The dog, its eyes growing brighter, snarled and attacked with greater vengeance. Farrell jogged 100 yards back to where he'd parked his car. He drove to the crossroads and got out to enter a public telephone booth. As he dialed, he felt his blood warming. He let the rings repeat until he heard the breathless, angry voice of Ecker. "Yeah?" He assumed a nasal drawl, which he'd practiced repeatedly through the week. "Raw, Ecker." "So?" "Forget bringing in those supplies tomorrow morning." "Why the hell not?" "He doesn't want to be disturbed." "All right. Let him starve then." "Hurry it up on those dogs." "That's what I'm doing," Ecker said. He returned to his car as darkness began enveloping the community. The macadam leading in the direction of Bryn Mart's land ran south in dipping curves. Farrell drove in that direction, passing the ranch, then turning right on another highway. When he reached the small road at the rear of the property where Vince Ecker had brought him the night of the hunt, he got out and opened the trunk to remove the rifle. A cow was standing in the distance, but he could not see it because of the increasing darkness. He moved swiftly over the tufted field, over a rise and into the small valley where the raccoon had been killed by the dogs. He walked over another rise and stopped beside the small wind-shaped tree. The windows of the house used by Cass Rawl were dark. He truly hoped that Rawl was gone. The wide window of the large main house was lighted. Feeling his nerves tingling, he saw that Martin Bryn Mawr was reading in the chair near the desk and fireplace. Farrell lifted the rifle and sighted through the scope. His heart was bumping, but he forced himself to hold the rifle steady. His fingers squeezed. The report sounded cannon-like in his ears. The kick of the rifle spun him half around. Then he looked again. Bryn Mawr was slumped in the chair. He hurried to his car and placed the rifle in the back seat. As he drove away, he was thinking that he might not have been able to shoot a deer or a raccoon or even a rabbit, but Bryn Mawr was just another human being. When he reached the edge of the community, he stopped the car off the highway. He put on leather gloves and quickly cleaned, then oiled the rifle. He returned it to the trunk and minutes later parked in front of the copper lantern. He was seated at the bar, sipping a beer, when Ecker arrived. Ecker ignored him and sat down angrily. "Damn stupid dog." Farrell half smiled. "How's the hunting, Ecker?" "Might be all right if they knew how to make rifles." "Thought you said that Winchester was the best." "Tried it this morning. I've done better with the carbine. It was off a mile. Had to fix it all over again." "Maybe now you can hit a raccoon clean enough to kill it," Farrell said dryly. "Raccoon? I'm going for the big stuff from now on." "Like what?" "Maybe go up to the Sierra and get a bear. Cat, maybe. Maybe go down south and find a pig. I told you about them wild boars, didn't I?" "Yes," Farrell said, and finished his beer. He walked outside and stood beside his car until another pulled away from the general store down the street. Then he put on the gloves again and exchanged the Winchester from the trunk with the one held by the clamps in Ecker's pickup. He placed that in the back section of the Plymouth on the floor, then drove down a winding road to Palo Alto. He crossed through town to the Dumbarton Bridge, where traffic was light. Halfway across, he stopped and leaned from a window to throw the rifle over a guardrail into the bay. At 20 minutes to 9 the next morning, he again stood inside the public telephone booth dialing Vince Ecker's number. "Who?" Ecker demanded. "Farrell." "So?" "You were talking about cats last night. I saw one down the highway." Ecker's voice assumed immediate interest. "Where?" "You know that little road that cuts off the highway just north of the road to Bryn Mawr's place?" "What kind of cat?" "Big." "Wildcat?" "Looked bigger." "How big?" 5 feet long, maybe 6. He could hear Ecker's breath drawing in. "Mean looking," Farrell said. "Mountain lion, I figure. Maybe came down from the north. I ought to phone the sheriff. Animal like that—" "You leave it to me, you hear? I'll take care of it. Small Creek Road is just that place." "That's it." Farrell drove south, meeting a single car. He turned onto the narrow length of blacktop marked Small Creek Road and stopped out of sight from the highway. Minutes later, Ecker's truck skidded to a halt behind the Plymouth. Ecker got out with his rifle held tightly in one large hand. He released 3 dogs from their compartment. "Which way?" The sun glinted against his sunglasses. "Down," Farrell said. "Through those trees, along the creek towards the valley." 5, 6 feet? Swear it was. Ecker motioned his dogs ahead and followed, running. Farrell waited until he heard them deep in the trees. Then from a pocket, he drew a bottle of tan makeup purchased at a variety store. He smoothed it over his face. He fitted on a pair of ski-type sunglasses. Finally, he removed from a foil-lined carton a black parka and a white medium-brimmed Stetson. He put them on and placed the carton on the right-hand side of the seat of Ecker's truck. He turned the key of the pickup and back to the highway. Then he drove to the road leading to Martin Bryn Mawr's fenced acreage. When he neared the small house used by Cass Rawl, his palms had become so wet he could no longer hold on to the steering wheel. He stopped and put on his gloves. Then he forced himself to drive the truck to the gate. Through the dark glasses, he saw Rawl appear at the doorway of his house. Rawl glared at him, but the gate opened. Farrell drove through, breathing hard. He stopped at a side door of the large house and carried the empty carton out of the truck. His worst moment arrived when he became certain that the door would be locked. It wasn't. He stepped inside and began looking for the room where Bryn Mawr would be in that leather chair. After several tries, he found it. He looked at the man, at what was left of him after the tearing slug from the high-powered rifle had created its destruction. Then he strode to the desk and located the lever beneath the corner. Paneling slid back. Farrell stared at the packets of currency stacked there. Finally, with shaking gloved hands, he was able to transfer the packets into the carton. He looked around the room, feeling an increasing greed, and noticed a sheet of paper on the surface of the desk. He stepped closer and read the beginning of the note. "To whom it may concern, I, Martin Bryn Mawr, hereby reveal the following events." He read no further, feeling a fresh panic. Had Bryn Mawr somehow known that he'd been observed? Had Farrell been seen that night of the raccoon hunt? And had Bryn Mawr written something? Farrell grabbed the paper, folded it swiftly, and slid it into an inner compartment of his wallet. He picked up the carton and returned to the truck. He did not look at Rawl's house as he drove through the gate. Through a rearview mirror, he saw it closing behind him. He reparked the truck where he'd met Ecker and carried the carton to the trunk of his car, where he placed it beside a small spade. He removed the sunglasses, parka, and hat, put them in the carton, and closed the trunk. He wiped his face with a handkerchief, then got behind the wheel of the Plymouth and drove back to the highway. Following the undulating road, he drove 15 miles south. He stopped on a turnout in a heavily wooded area. When no other cars were in sight, he got out and retrieved the carton. He carried it with a spade into the woods. In a small clearing, he dug a deep hole, fitted the carton down, then scooped earth back and smoothed pine needles over the surface. On the way home, he threw the spade and makeup-stained handkerchief from the window. When he walked into a small cabin and sat down in his chair, he was exhausted. His mind went entirely blank. Millie kept complaining to him, but her voice seemed very far away, and the words she spoke were unintelligible. 1 year, 2 months, and 5 days later, David Farrell sat near a window of a large stone house. Encircled by a corrugated steel fence, the structure had a fortress-like quality and blended smoothly with the flat Nevada sagebrush land. Located well off the highway, outside Reno, Farrell could see nothing immediate but sage and brown earth and rock. In the distance, the bluish rise of mountains was fading in the wavering light of late afternoon. He stood up feeling edgy. There were smudges of darkness beneath his eyes. He paced slowly through the silent house, from room to room, trying to find satisfaction in this haven and finding none. He thought of going out to the front patio to sit for a while before the cold night sharpened the air, but he decided against it, as he had for weeks. A bit later, he would have to walk out to the gate anyway to see if there was mail. That would be enough exposure. He could never be certain. He knew what a good rifle could do at 500 yards. He sat down in his living room and stared at a cold fireplace. He thought back, as he did every day, to how well it had gone once Cass Rawl had decided to go into Martin Bryn Mawr's house and found him dead in the library. They arrested Vince Ecker 2 hours later. The next day, a sheriff's detective had come to question Farrell at length. When Ecker's case had come to trial, Farrell had been required to go on the witness stand. Ecker kept shouting his accusations. Several times he had to be physically restrained, But Farrell had answered the questions in a polite, shy manner, which, he knew, had suited the jury. His performance had been in complete contrast to Ecker's screaming and shouting. "The defendant has made the claim, Mr. Farrell, that he was, in his words, framed, that you, in fact, fired the rifle, that ballistic tests have proven to be the murder weapon." "I'm aware of that." "Is there any truth to it?" "Certainly not." Ecker, swearing, was in high fury, his face mottled with rage. "It is the defendant's contention that you switched rifles in his truck, shot the deceased yourself from a hill, then tricked the defendant into trailing a non-existent cat of some description while you entered the fenced retreat of the deceased in the disguise of the defendant to steal valuables which might have been hidden behind paneling in the library. Did you?" Farrell displayed a certain amount of incredulity at the proposition. "I've heard the contention, sir. I continue to be surprised by it. No, sir, nothing like that happened." The cords of Ecker's neck bulged like taut ropes. "You did not exchange rifles with the defendant." "I did not." "You did not shoot the deceased." "I wouldn't kill a rabbit, sir, let alone Mr. Bryn Mawr. I did not." "You did not phone the defendant to explain that you'd seen a wild animal, which caused him to meet you at a location called Small Creek Road." "No, sir." "You did not send the defendant on a chase after that animal, then disguise yourself in apparel similar to his and drive his truck onto the property of the deceased." "Certainly not." "You did not see the defendant at all that day." "Yes, sir. As I was driving south on the highway near 9 o'clock, as I often do on a Saturday, I saw him drive his truck onto the road leading to the house of the deceased." When his testimony had been completed, he'd smiled at the jury, then left the stand. He'd known fairly certainly that it was going to work when he'd heard the testimony of Cass Rawle. "Please tell me, Mr. Rawle, are you absolutely certain that the driver of the truck who went through the gate the day following the established murder time of the deceased was Vincent Albert Ecker?" Farrell watched Cass Rawle's eyes shine with the hatred of the devoted servant who has lost his master at the hands of the enemy. Cass Rawle said, "Vince Ecker, all right." He knew positively that was going to work when the prosecuting attorney summarized his case by characterizing Ecker as a sadistic killer who would go to any means to accomplish his selfish mission, in this case the theft of an undetermined amount of money still unfound because it had been hidden away by the defendant. Ecker had put the finishing touch on the performance by shouting, accusing, and raging in such a fashion that not a juror felt him to be anything but what he had been betrayed to be by the prosecution. Farrell had hoped that he would be given the gas chamber, but Ecker had gotten a life sentence instead. That had been good enough anyway. Farrell had since learned that Ecker's performance in prison as a surly, halting, bullying, provocative inmate continually precluded any possibility for eventual parole. Farrell stalked into his library lined with every book he had ever wanted to read, but he had not been able to concentrate on anything these past weeks. He was nervous, feeling a growing fear of some unknown quantity which could destroy him. Yet he knew that was absurd. He had perfect protection here. He had not made the mistakes Bryn Mawr had. He had refused to bring in dogs because that would have required dependence upon a trainer. He allowed his supplies to be brought only to the gate and left outside until he picked them up. Nobody came through the gate but himself. Yet he had to walk through the open to reach that gate and collect supplies and mail. Each time that he was required to do it, his apprehension became greater. He sat down and rubbed his palms over his knees. He'd also been thinking about women. Not Millie, certainly. He'd taken care of her easily after Ecker had been sent to prison. He had picked up an easy brunette in the Copper Lantern, then began an obvious affair that had reached Millie's ears quickly in that small community. She divorced him. But based on his book clerk's income, she had gotten very little from him. She'd remarried in a short time, and even that small alimony was no longer necessary. No, he did not want Millie, but any other woman. Yet how could he risk leaving this place to find one? He tried not to think about repeating his most familiar thoughts, reviewing the possibility of having made a mistake somewhere. The largest, he was certain, had been taking that sheet of paper from Martin Bridmark's desk. He stood up again and resumed pacing, feeling his blood pumping. At first he had worried most about the condition of that money in the foil-lined carton, but when he had finally dug it up, he discovered that it had been preserved perfectly. Then he'd worried about demonstrating any sort of affluence by spending some of it. But he'd gotten the idea of moving to Reno, where he had claimed heavy winnings on small stakes in the casinos. He had even declared the winnings on his income tax report and paid taxes on them. No one had questioned anything. It all came back to having taken that note Bryn Mawr had written. Because of the state of shock that had hit him that evening, he could not remember removing it from his pocket, the wallet which contained the note, but he must have because it disappeared. He recalled that he had demanded of Millie that she find it, but she could not. Finally, he had looked at the moist, wicked face of Jolly and realized that the baby had picked it up and hidden it somewhere. But up to the time of his divorce, he had not found where that was. What, he asked himself, had been contained in the rest of that note? Where was it now? Who had read it? Would it be enough to implicate him? And did Millie have it, waiting to use it on him? He turned on a transistor radio on a shelf, wanting to remove that thought. Then he switched the radio off immediately. Voices coming into this house and telling him of the outside world had ceased to interest him and only made him more nervous. He had also canceled his newspaper subscription weeks ago. He paced again, thinking of all he had planned to do if he should ever gain the seclusion and independence owned by Martin Bryn Mawr. Now that he had achieved them, he could concentrate on nothing. He had even begun to hate his once-loved animals, which had become hated sounds in the night. Rabbits, coyotes, wildcats, mountain lions, prowling and searching, padding, climbing, causing him to lie in his bed with sweat beading on his forehead and his nerves trembling. All he could honestly think of was having made a mistake somewhere, leaving a small gate open, something that would bring destruction down on him. At the near gloom of twilight, he stood beside a window and peered toward the highway as the red mail truck stopped beside his box on the other side of the gate. He watched the carrier, who was a slope-shouldered man with a reddish mustache, deposit something. The man had, in the beginning, tried to stall till Farrell came out to inspect that box. But Farrell would have none of it. Even now the man looked curiously and hopefully toward the house, as though Farrell might come out. The truck finally rolled on. Then he walked to the heavy front door, which he kept locked and bolted. He well remembered that Martin Bryn Mawr had failed to do that. He stood there, feeling a familiar weakness going through him. His palms became moist. Finally, he slid the bolt, then turned the handle. He pushed the door open and stepped out. He looked across the expanse of white gravel drive that he would have to traverse in order to reach the gate. Then he would have to unlock that gate and hurry out to check the contents of the mailbox, all of which become a nearly unbearable task these past days. But his curiosity was too strong. The mailman had placed something in there. It might be a bill, or it might only be junk mail. But he had to know. He ran along the gravel to the gate and inserted a key into the lock. He turned it, then jumped out to yank the lid of the box down. He grabbed a small package wrapped in brown paper, seeing that it had been addressed to him in Millie's familiar hand. He returned through the gate, kicked it shut, and locked it, then trotted back towards the house. When he had nearly reached the door, he was certain that he saw something moving beyond the fence to the east. He stopped, heart speeding. There was a clumping of sage there. Whatever it had been, he was certain, had moved behind that protection. But the light now was deceiving. He broke into a run and leapt into the house to close the door behind him and bolt it. He threw the package on a sofa, then hurried to an east window. He looked out, his face by the seal, but he could see nothing. Imagination, he thought, or something harmless like a jackrabbit. He returned to the sofa and sat down, not assured. He picked up the package and looked at it more carefully to see that it was correctly addressed. Well, he had made no effort to go into absolute hiding. He'd given a forwarding address to the small post office in that crossroads community. If he had tried to disappear entirely, it would definitely have been suspicious. She probably inquired of the postmistress and gotten the address that way. He tore the brown paper away from a flat pasteboard box. He opened it to see his wallet. He removed it as a small white card fell away. He read the message. David, I found this when I was cleaning the house, as George and I are moving to much larger quarters. It was inside the register of the heater in the living room, where I guess Jolly put it, sliding it down a vent. As you'll notice, there are only $2 inside, which I did not touch. I am sending it not out of any respect for you, as you hurt me all right, but because it has your various cards you were so upset about losing. I'm only trying to be honorable, no matter how much anguish you have caused me. Yours truly, Millie. He opened the compartment which contained his various cards, then he looked inside the second compartment where he placed the note from Bryn Mawr's desk. He pulled out the folded paper. Had she opened that compartment too, to find this? He threw the wallet aside and got up with the paper. He walked in a fast circle around the room. Then he hurried to his library, where he switched on a desk light and sat down to read. To whom it may concern, I, Martin Bryn Mawr, hereby reveal the following events, beginning with the decline of my partner, Albert Henshaw. It was true that Albert engaged in dishonest measures which profited him greatly at the expense of many innocent people, as was stated in his suicide note found beside his body in his car where he died of carbon monoxide poisoning. What is not true is that he later filtered away those profits, as was stated in his note. What is not true is that I knew nothing of his dealings. What is not true is that he willingly committed suicide. I discovered his manipulations, after which time I confronted Albert with my knowledge. By threatening exposure of him to his wife, to his daughter, to his son, to his friends, I was able to extract the whereabouts of that money. By working on his shame and guilt, I was able to get him drunk, after which I carried him to his garage and placed him in the car. It will be remembered that a large percentage of alcohol was found in Albert's blood, as well as a half-consumed bottle beside him in the death car. But Albert was intoxicated before the car's engine was started. By me. I have since experienced an increasing torment for that deed. The money, first gained by Albert, is tainted money. It has made me a prisoner in this hated stockade I have created in these wretched hills. I have received nothing but hell in exchange, secluding myself in this fashion, afraid, nerves nearly shot. I damn the money and all it has caused. All that I desire now, as Albert did before me, is some release from my torment. I invite, welcome any release. The handwriting became nearly illegible near the end. The letter had not been completed. Farrell continued to stare at the words. Then he stood up suddenly, eyes shining with fear. Millie had read it, he thought. Yet why had she sent it to him, giving the evidence away that he had been in Bryn Mawr's house? Then he nodded quickly, a muscle flickering along a cheek. She was playing with him. Like Ecker, playing with a wounded raccoon. Sadistic. Devilish. He whirled, hearing something moving outside. He ran to the window and yanked the cord to snap the drapes shut. His mouth had turned dry. He tried to swallow and could not. Ecker, he thought, reaching that absolute and inevitable conclusion he should have reached months ago. You couldn't cage a man like that. Somehow, some way. He switched off the desk lamp and stood in the darkness, shaking with a strong chill. His hearing for any alien sound had become acute. Now he heard something very alien. Someone running out there. He fell to the floor and pressed his cheek tightly against the rug. He listened, shaking badly, licking his dry lips, but now there was only silence. Slowly he crawled toward the shelf where the transistor radio rested. He reached up and turned on the switch. Soft music played through the room. He lay shaking very badly now. The music stopped abruptly, and a man's voice said, "There have been no further developments on the escape of a convicted killer believed to have fled to this area." As his hand jerked up to turn up the volume, the radio was jarred from the shelf. It crashed to the floor, and the voice was gone. He pressed his cheek against the rug again, breathing hard, listening. He should have known that he could never have defeated an animal like that. It was like trying to defeat a wild boar, as Edgar had so often described. You shot to kill, and if it didn't work, it came looking for you, tracking you, mean and vicious. Farrell began to whimper, eyes hot with tears. He thought of Martin Bryn Mawr's written words. I damn the money and all it has caused. Cheek to rug, lying flat beside the desk, he envisioned the special womb he had created for it with his own hands. A trap door recess right there beneath the desk. He heard that sound of running again, closer now. He whimpered once more, shaking violently. Finally, he rolled to his stomach, then began inching closer to the desk. He slid his trembling fingers along the grain of the rug, searching. He had found the clasp that held the fabric flat, loosened them, then peeled the rug back. He managed to find a key in his pocket and inserted it into a heavy lock built into the oak planking of the floor. He turned the key and lifted the trap door. He began removing packets of currency. At last he pushed himself up to his knees, then to his feet. He stood swaying drunkenly, holding one of the packets. He staggered to the drape cord and yanked it. The drapes were drawn open with a thin, whistling sound. With his free hand he reached out and switched on the ceiling lights, bathing himself in hard white brightness. Gasping for breath, eyes wild, he unlatched the window and threw it open, staring into the darkness. "Ecker?" He listened and heard nothing. He held up the packet of money and shook it, wanting only to be free of his torment. "Vince Ecker!" He saw the muzzle flash. He did not hear the explosion. Dusty, thick-soled shoes stopped beside the bloodied body. A stub-fingered hand gathered up the packets of currency. A pulpy, ultimately cruel face creased with a smile. Minutes later, David Farrell was alone in his house. Well, there you go. That was The Tormented by James McKimmey. As I mentioned earlier, this story is included in a Stark House Anthology, literally called the Stark House Anthology, edited by Rick Ullerman and Greg Shepard.